I'd like to start by welcoming everyone and acknowledging that the land on which Brock is located is the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe peoples, many of whom continue to live and work here today. The territory is also covered by the Upper Canada Treaties and is within the land protected by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Agreement. Today, the gathering place is home to many First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people, and acknowledging this reminds us that our great standard of living is directly related to the resources and friendship of Indigenous people. And of course, as treaty people ourselves, we have responsibilities to be in good relationship. And as many of you may be joining from different locations, as we gather together virtually, it's helpful to consider whose ancestral land your feet may be resting upon. And for any of you who don't have it already in your schedule, just a quick reminder that Brock is hosting the powwow on January 17th, in case you want to add that into your schedule. And I will turn things over to Ingrid.
Thank you, Dawn. Hi, everyone, and welcome to what has become an annual research colloquium in the Faculty of Social Sciences. I'm really pleased to welcome everyone here today, our presenters, our guest speakers, as well as our audience. Today, we're going to explore just a very few examples of the amazing breadth and research and scholarship that is done by our faculty and by our students in our departments and centers across the faculty. Importantly, of course, this research is housed in social sciences, but it draws on faculty and students and ideas and collaborations from across the university as well as across disciplines. Each year, we hear from 2 faculty members who have been recognized for their research in the social sciences with the Early Career Researcher and Distinguished Researcher Awards. Those are going to be part of our agenda in part 2. Before that, however, we have presentations from our student researchers, again, an example of the many accomplishments of our students in the faculty. Before that, I would like to invite Associate Dean Brian Roy to say a few words on behalf of the Faculty of Graduate Studies and Postdoctoral Affairs. Brian, thank you so much for agreeing to come and speak to us.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you, Dean Mackes, for inviting me to speak to you this morning. It's truly an honor to be here. To begin, I'd like to congratulate all the graduate students and their faculty mentors. You are the backbone of this institution, and it's my understanding that today's graduate student speakers were selected from among the winners of the Faculty of Social Science Student Research Award, which recognizes students who are working to advance research and scholarship in the Faculty of Social Sciences. I'd like to congratulate all the student researchers who were chosen as recipients of this very prestigious and competitive award. We are proud to have your research representing graduate studies here at Brock University. I'd also like to thank Dean Mackes and her team and the Faculty of Social Sciences for seeing the importance of investing in and recognizing the great work our graduate students do. I'd also like to take a minute to recognize some of the other outstanding students in FOSS who are currently holding prestigious external awards. This year, the Faculty of Social Sciences has 1 student holding a Vanier Award, 11 students holding SSHRC Doctoral Awards, 9 students holding SSHRC Master's Awards, 1 student holding an NSERC Master's Award, and another student holding an NSERC Doctoral Award, plus 34 students holding OGS, and 1 student holding a QE2. I really want to challenge all these award winners, as these organizations are making an investment in you. And so you need to do your best to advance your respective areas of research, as your success really helps us all. It raises the profile of our university and the great research that goes on here. So keep up the great work, and congratulations to all of you. And if anyone here today has not yet applied for an external award, I would encourage you to do so. Writing award applications is excellent practice for your future grant applications and can help provide a greater level of financial support. Winning external awards also looks great on your CV, and we have a great team of people here in the Faculty of Grad Studies and Postdoctoral Affairs who are here to help with your application. So please reach out to us for assistance or to attend one of our many workshops. So events like this today are a very important part of what we do here at Brock, especially for our graduate students. As researchers, we're deeply immersed in our work, often exploring complex concepts and contributing new knowledge to our fields. However, it's not enough to simply come up with a great new idea and just sort of stay in the lab or in our respective fields of research. But we have to get out and share that with the public and have a meaningful impact. So that's where knowledge translation events come in. These events are invaluable opportunities for us to bridge the gap between academia and the wider world, whether that's, to talking with policymakers, industry professionals, or the general public. Knowledge translation is about taking the research we've done in the lab, the library, the field, and communicating it effectively to others, especially to those who can possibly benefit from it directly. By participating in knowledge translation events, graduate students gain essential skills that go beyond the academic writing, and you learn how to communicate complex ideas clearly and clearly and articulately to people who might not have a deep understanding of the topic area. So you really have to learn how to tailor your message for different audiences and how to highlight the real-world application of your research. These skills are invaluable, not only for your continued academic success, but for career development in any field. Furthermore, engaging in knowledge translation fosters collaboration and creates opportunities for feedback. It allows us to connect with experts outside of our research areas and to even open up doors to interdisciplinary collaborations, mentorship, or career paths that you hadn't even considered before. You never know what you might learn along the way or who you're going to meet, and they could have a huge impact on your own research. And I'll just tell you a little story of an example of that. One of my mentors and colleagues was at a conference and gave a presentation on their research. And they were heading out for a run after that, and someone came up to him and said, "Hey, would you mind if I joined you on your run?" And so they just chatted about the research and really sort of brought it together. And a week later, my colleague received a phone call, and it was this individual who they'd met and at this conference, and they said, I'd really like to expand our conversation on what we were talking about and what you're envisioning for the future for your research and what you want to build when it comes to your actual research expertise. And so my friend and colleague went and said, "Well, that's great, but you live down in the United States somewhere." And he said, "No problem. I'll send you my jet, and they'll fly you down to my place here for the weekend." And so it turns out that this individual wanted to make a multi-million-dollar investment in my colleague's clinical research facility, and that's what happened, purely from a conversation that started after a conference. So you never know who you might meet along the way. So I encourage all of us to embrace these events, not just a way to share our work, but as a way to grow as scholars and communicators and to contribute to the broader conversations that shape the future. If you're interested in working on your knowledge translation skills, Stacia Heaton, our Manager of Graduate Student Success, can walk you through some of our FGS events like GradFlix, Mapping New Knowledges, 3MT, and other workshops we run in preparation for all of them to help you learn the necessary skills to be confident in how you present your research. So again, thank you for inviting me here today. I look forward to hearing about the exciting work being done here in the Faculty of Social Sciences. And once again, congratulations to all the award recipients and presenters. So thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Brian, especially for sharing that really inspiring story, because you do never know who might be listening. And we'd also like to thank Dean Curtin from the Faculty of Graduate Studies and Postdoctoral Affairs for the continued support of this event and the graduate students in the Faculty of Social Sciences. Brian highlighted the many supports that are available there, and I strongly encourage graduate students to take advantage of those. The Faculty of Social Sciences is dedicated to encouraging our next generation of researchers, and until recently, we offered an internal FOSS Student Research Award for PhD candidates all the way to senior undergraduate students, whose programs included a research component, and the award was designed to recognize student research that contributes to and advances research and scholarship in the social sciences. Now, for several years, this annual research colloquium has included recipients of the FOSS Student Awards. Our FOSS students who have received the award then apply to this colloquium, and we go through a selection process. So today I'm very pleased to announce the 3 student presenters that we selected. First, we'll be listening to Anton Dinh. He's currently pursuing an MA in psychology under the supervision of Paula Duarte Guterman, who's an assistant professor in psychology as well as a Tier 2 CRC. The title of the talk will be Parental Experience Uniquely Affects Cognition and Anxiety-like Behavior in Both Sexes of a Biparental Species. Then we'll be moving on to Kristen Grant, who's pursuing an MA in Applied Disability Studies under the supervision of Kendra Thompson, an associate professor in the Department of Applied Disability Studies. And her talk is entitled Exploring the Effect of One-on-One Acceptance and Commitment Training Sessions on Staff Engagement and Committed Actions Using Ecological Momentary Assessment. And our final student speaker in this session will be Hannah Marlen Lübker, who's pursuing a PhD in sustainability science under the supervision of Julia Baird, an associate professor cross-appointed to Environmental Sustainability Research Center and the Department of Geography and Tourism. She's currently serving as the director of ERC and is a Tier 2 CRC as well, and that title will be Socio-Ecological Empathy and its Relevance for the Sustainability Science. Now we'll go through each of the presenters in turn, and then we will welcome questions from our audience, and I'll do the moderation for that discussion.
Hi, I just wanted to say thank you so much to the Faculty of Social Sciences for inviting me and for everyone for attending. My name is Anton. I'm a second-year master's student in the Department of Psychology, and the title of my research project is Comparing the Effects of Parental Experience on Cognition and Anxiety-like Behavior in a Biparental Species. So to start us off with some background on motherhood, maternal experience typically refers to the process of becoming pregnant, carrying the pregnancy to term, and or taking care of the child in the postpartum period. And so in all species, the experience of mothers are incredibly diverse, and especially in humans, it doesn't necessarily have to contain all of these elements, but it is dependent on cultural and social factors. And so these external factors ultimately influence the support that's provided to the mother, and this can drastically change the experience of mothers. And additionally, in humans, motherhood is associated with various physiological changes. Next, please. And so starting with hormonal profiles, various hormones such as estradiol, cortisol, and progesterone drastically increase during pregnancy. And this is to maintain the pregnancy, to facilitate childbirth, and initiate maternal behavior. These changes do extend into the postpartum period as well, but we do see a sharp decline back to baseline levels. And so unsurprisingly, these drastic changes in hormonal levels are influencing the brain and could potentially be having an effect on behavior as well. And so in regard to the neural changes, current studies that have taken a look at gray matter brain volume of women before pregnancy and after giving birth shows that there is a reduction in gray matter brain volume in various regions of the brain, including the hippocampus, amygdala, and regions of the cortex. And so this reduction begins during pregnancy and persists into the postpartum, and even up to 6 years after childbirth, we see that gray matter brain volume does not bounce back to baseline levels. However, it's important to note that these decreases in brain volume isn't necessarily a bad thing, and it could actually serve as a predictor for overall attachment between the mother and the infant. And so there are some functional implications of these changes in gray matter brain volume. Next, please. And so in humans, although it is very much understudied, some research does suggest that fatherhood is also associated with various physiological changes as well. And so studies that have compared the hormonal levels as well as brain volume before the period in which their partners were pregnant, and then after the period that their partners gave birth, we see lots of reductions or decreases in concentration levels of hormones, as well as a reduction in overall brain volume as well. But it is important to note that although there is a conflicting research on the experience of fathers, where some studies have shown little to no change over time, and other studies showing that there is a difference. Next, please. But the even bigger issue is that there's a limited number of studies on the changes that's associated with fatherhood, and as a result, the effects of fatherhood are not very well characterized. Next, please. And so despite these studies that do suggest these physiological, hormonal, and neural changes that's associated with mother and fatherhood, it's unclear how these changes are contributing to behavior. For instance, are there effects on cognition or anxiety? And although we do know a bit about the attachment work that's done in human mothers, in order to simultaneously study behavior and the neural mechanisms that potentially underlie these changes, we rely on non-human models. And so that then leads to my main research inquiry of my project, which aims to uncover how such an important life experience, that being parenthood, can influence behavior and remodel the brain in both mothers and fathers. And so the animal model that we use in the lab are dagus. And so dagus are a species that's native to South America, and they're dispersed across Chile, but we can study them in a lab environment. They are closely related to other well-known rodent species such as chinchillas and guinea pigs. And dagus are highly social. They have very complex organizations and behaviors in the wild, and this makes them a good model for studying social isolation, emotional development, as well as attachment bonds between mothers and offspring. Next, please. And so just a brief life history of the dagu. So when they're born, they're fully furred and readily mobile, so they can move around. They have their eyes open and they could hear. Next, please. And so the mothers are pregnant for 90 days and their weaning is between 5 to 6 weeks. So in the wild, this is when typically the offspring will leave the nest. And both males and females are sexually mature by about 4 to 6 months. Next, please. However, in a lab setting, we do wait until at least after 6 months to make sure that they have reached their adult weight. And so their adulthood is between 1 to 2 years, but in a captive setting, they could have a lifespan of up to 5 years and beyond. Next, please. And so what makes them an ideal species to study parental experience? It's the fact that they are a biparental species. So this means that both the mothers and the fathers take care of the offspring in the postpartum period. And so the common animal models that are used in the lab, being rats and mice, are monoparental. And so this means that only the mothers take care of the pups and the offspring in the postpartum period. And so as a result, the experience of motherhood with paternal assistance is understudied, and even more so, the experience of fathers is understudied. Next, please. And so this then leads to my experimental groups. So the first group are the non-breeding controls. So these are the same-sex pair-housed dagus. My second group are the biparental dagus. So here, males and females were paired for breeding, and after the offspring were born, both the mothers and the fathers were contributing to pup care in the postpartum period. My third group, I have the monoparental group. So again, males and females were paired for breeding, but after the pups were born, the males were removed from the cage, and so only the mothers were allowed to take care of the pups. And so then that transition leads to my fourth group, which are the sexually experienced males. So these were the males that were removed from the monoparental group. And so these males have the experience of breeding, but they don't have the experience of taking care of pups in the postpartum period. So no paternal experience. And so just a brief overview of my experimental timeline. Day one is gestation day one, where the breeding pairs were randomly assigned. The dagus are pregnant for 90 days following that. And when they give birth, we call this postpartum day one or PPD1. And after about 5 weeks, the pups are weaned. So here we remove them from the cages and put them in their own cage. A week after weaning, we then conducted behavioral testing to measure cognition and anxiety-like behavior. And on the final day, we collected their tissue for future analyses. And so now taking a look at some of my preliminary results, I'm going to be discussing two behavioral tasks that were measured. So the first measures for spatial learning and memory, and it's the Barnes maze task. So this is a 20-hole maze where one of the holes has an escape box. So the idea is that dagus don't like being out in the open, and there's a bright light above them. And so they want to find the hole that has the escape box in order to feel secure and hidden from the environment. And here in this video, we could see that the escape box is in the the far left there. And so essentially what we're measuring are the number of errors before the target hole. And this is calculated as a nose entry into a non-target hole. So every time they poke their head into a hole that is not the escape box, we consider this an error. And so to understand the graph of the results here, the y-axis indicates the total number of errors that were made by each animal per day. and the x-axis indicates the training days. So there were 4 training days, and each day consisted of 4 trials. So taking a look first at the biparental fathers in blue, we see that they were performing relatively poorly on day 1, but over the course of the next 4 days, they are performing quite better on average. And when we bring the other 2 male groups into the analysis, we can actually see that the non-breeding males, which are the open triangles, and the experienced males, which are the green squares, are performing very well from day 1, and they remain consistent across the 4 days. And so when we perform the analysis comparing the groups, we see that the biparental fathers, compared to the experienced males and the non-breeding males, are making significantly more errors on average. And so this is potentially suggesting impaired spatial learning in these biparental fathers due to them making more errors on day 1 compared to the other male groups that do not engage at, or that have not engaged in paternal experience. And so here we're comparing the total errors on the Barnes maze across the female group. So the graph X and Y axis remain the same as the previous graph, but the groups are different. So the biparental mothers are the purple circles. And again, here, these are the mothers that had the help of fathers in the postpartum period to take care of the pups. The monoparental mothers are the red squares, and these are the mothers that had the fathers removed, and so they were alone taking care of the pups, and the non-breeding females are the black triangles. So here we see the 3 groups performing relatively similar across the first 3 days, and on day 4 we see a significant difference, specifically between the monoparental mothers and the non-breeding females. And so in particular, what we see is that the monoparental mothers are making significantly fewer errors on average compared to the non-breeding females, and specifically on day 4. And so what this suggests is that these monoparental mothers are showing better spatial memory due to the fact that they were making less errors and finding the whole with less errors. And so the next behavioral measure is the elevated plus maze. And so this is a measure of anxiety-like behavior. So this apparatus is an elevated platform, and it contains 2 types of arms. So the closed arms with the walls, and so these are the arms that are facing the top right and the bottom left corner of the video. And then we also have the open walls, or the open arms, which don't contain any arms. And so these are the arms facing the top left and the bottom right of the video. So for this task, we're measuring the amount of time that the dagoos are spending in either the closed or the open arms. So the idea here is that more anxious animals will spend more time in the closed arms where there's no risk of falling off the maze and they feel more protected. And less anxious animals are going to explore more and thereby spend more time in the open arms where there's a risk of falling off and it's not as secure. So to understand this graph, the y-axis indicates the amount of time that was spent on different parts of the maze, and the x-axis indicates the open arms, the closed arms, and the center, so the 3 parts of the maze. And so here we're comparing the amount of time that was spent on each of the arms across the male groups. So again, the biparental fathers in blue, experienced males in green, and the non-breeding males as the open triangles. And so the results show that the fathers, biparental fathers, were spending significantly more time in the open arms compared to both the sexually experienced males and the non-breeding controls. And on top of that, they were spending less time in the closed arms compared to these groups as well. And again, this is an indicator of having less anxiety-like behavior in the biparental fathers due to the preference for the open arms. So they are not as anxious, and they'll explore the maze even in areas where they are more exposed and are at risk of falling off. And so overall, the results of this study suggest that biparental fathers so these are the ones that were co-parenting with mothers, have impaired spatial learning compared to experienced males and non-breeding males, specifically because they were making more errors on day 1 of the Barnes maze task. On the other hand, monoparental mothers were showing better spatial memory compared to non-breeding females, where they were making less errors on day 4 of the Barnes maze task. And lastly, biparental fathers were showing reduced anxiety-like behavior, where they were spending more time in the open arms compared to both the experienced males and the non-breeding males on the elevated plus maze task. And so lastly, just some brief insight into my future directions. I'm currently working on linking neuromechanisms to these behavioral differences that were observed in cognition and anxiety-like behavior. And so some of the neural markers that can potentially help us account for these differences in behavior between the different groups include neurogenesis. So this is the production of new neurons in the brain, as well as the neuroimmune system, so the inflammatory response in the brain. And so thank you so much for listening. I hope you all enjoyed. I wanted to give special thanks to my supervisor, Dr. Duarte Guterman, and collaborator, Dr. Scandalis, along with members on my committee, Dr. Reinecke and Dr. McCormick. Also to Prince and Julia and the rest of the lab for helping significantly with this project. And of course, thank you to OGS and a special thank you to Brock's Faculty of Social Sciences for granting me the research award that's helped fund this project and make all of this possible. Thank you so much for listening.
So, hello and thank you to the social science faculty for the opportunity to share my research today. I'll be talking about examining the effect of one-to-one acceptance and commitment training coaching sessions on staff engagement and committed actions by means of self-monitoring using a smartphone application. As someone who has frontline and supervisory experience in group homes for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, I can attest to the levels of stress experienced. As a frontline staff, there are constantly staff calling in for shifts, and being short-staffed in a group home can become overwhelming very quickly. As a supervisory transitional planner, it was incredibly challenging when I had to advocate for geriatric services for the aging population of the agency I worked at. Facilitating referrals to geriatric specialists for residents who weren't seniors but were showing early onset signs of dementia was met with a lot of pushback from specialists. This resulted in an immense amount of moral distress as I knew what was needed, but it seemed impossible to obtain. Longitudinal research conducted at the Center for Addiction and Mental Health emphasizes the challenging and stressful reality for frontline support staff, which was exacerbated by the pandemic. Staff working in frontline support roles in mental health hospital settings have reported decreases in morale, fatigue, exhaustion, and serious burnout. Although the literature is incredibly scarce, in one study by Alexander and Hegarty, some of the highest levels of stress have been reported by senior level management and clinicians. Direct care staff report experiencing stress based on interpersonal dynamics with senior level staff. Senior level staff report experiencing stress stemming from uncooperative staff and staff shortages. As a senior staff, I felt a lot of pressure from frontline staff to coordinate appointments for the aging residents. They didn't see everything going on behind the scenes, so despite their advocacy being well intended, it also added stress to an already stressful situation. These variables ultimately impact the entire ecosystem, including the quality of care for individuals receiving care. All levels of staff, along with the individuals receiving support, all function within a related network of behaviors, all contributing to impacts on each group within this network. For example, if people with IDD are engaging in high levels of challenging behavior, this may increase stress that staff experience and impact the quality of care provided. ACT training in behavior analysis is meant to promote wellness, but not in a therapy setting. It is evidence-based and focuses on developing psychological flexibility through 6 interrelated processes, whereas ACT therapy is delivered as a part of psychotherapy. The goal is to teach skills that allow someone to be more present in their lives and to change or continue behaviors in line with their values. This is intended to promote access to meaningful outcomes within their unique environment, such as positive social interactions amongst coworkers. The focus of this research is on 2 of the 6 processes, values and committed action. A goal of ACT is clarifying values, of which there are many and are personal. For example, being open. Values are not an endpoint to the ACT process, rather an ongoing compass for engagement that allows an individual to continue to practice the processes learned through ACT. You can never achieve being the most open person in the world, but you can only behave in ways that promote alignment with the value. Committed actions are related to values. For example, someone who values accountability in the workplace may determine that committed actions or observable behaviors that are in line with this value are arriving to meetings 5 minutes early and responding to emails within 1 business day. Research has been conducted which has yielded positive outcomes with direct support staff. Although staff have reported that their perceived level of stress has not been impacted by ACT in some research, they reported improved psychological health and overall job satisfaction. Research that examines the effect of individualized ACT coaching is scarce, specifically with senior level management on observable outcomes. Few studies have been conducted which examine objective outcomes following the delivery of ACT. Ecological Momentary Assessment, or EMA, serves as a consolidation of technological innovation self-monitoring research has experienced since the days of traditional pen and paper data sheets. Participants record behavior as it occurs with the ease of access through their smartphone. Some applications of this technology have been to examine interactions between staff and clients and students' academic behavior and stress levels. The current research was developed using Gold et al. As a framework. They delivered 6 one-to-one ACT coaching sessions to 3 parents of children with autism and measured the frequency of engagement and committed actions using a traditional self-monitoring procedure, a journal to record engagement. Results supported a significant increase in engagement and committed actions, along with positive changes in self-report measures, including improvements in psychological well-being. We aim to extend the literature by recruiting senior level management and clinicians from a community support agency to participate in one-to-one ACT coaching sessions focusing on committed actions following a group-based ACT workshop. We were aiming to determine the effect of EMA alone on the engagement of committed actions, followed by the pairing of EMA and ACT to observe any potential additive effect on behavior. Through this study, we were hoping to examine if EMA increased engagement in committed actions, if ACT coaching sessions and EMA increased engagement in committed actions, and if staff and agency leaders reported these methods were acceptable. We hypothesized that engagement in committed actions would increase following the transition to each phase of the study with an overall increasing trend across the study. We expected that participants and agency leaders would report satisfaction with the research process. And finally, that staff would report positive experiences with EMA along with the one-to-one coaching sessions. A concurrent multiple baseline design across 4 participants was utilized, which is an appropriate design for exploratory research with a small sample size. The study consisted of 2 independent variables, 3 one-hour, one-to-one ACT coaching sessions focusing on committed actions and the incorporation of the EMA application. The dependent variable was the daily occurrence of committed actions. All sessions were adapted from the Gold et al. Study conducted with parents of children with autism. Each session began with a check-in, followed by a grounding exercise. Discussions and experiential exercises. For example, one activity was a self-compassion exercise. And each session concluded with a brief review of the participants' committed action and review of the EMA app. Session 3 ended with a discussion about continuing to engage in committed actions following the coaching sessions. 2 groups of senior staff and clinicians were the participant pool which the recruitment process involved. 5 participants were recruited from the group. 1 staff withdrew on the first day of the baseline phase. Participants were between the ages of 25 and 64. They all had master's degrees, and they had between 0 to 19 years of experience. The experimental phase consisted of baseline, intervention, post-intervention, and follow-up. During the baseline phase, participants used traditional self-monitoring procedures to collect data on engagement and committed actions. This took place for a minimum of 1 week. Phase 2 of the intervention consisted of participants utilizing EMA to self-monitor their engagement and committed actions. Once stable responding was observed, participants then transitioned into Phase 3 of the intervention, which consisted of EMA plus one-to-one ACT coaching sessions. During post-intervention, participants were asked to complete a social acceptability survey. And 1 month following the final coaching session, participants briefly met with the researchers to discuss how their experience with committed action engagement went since the conclusion of the intervention. They were asked to complete another social acceptability survey, and agency leaders were asked to complete a social acceptability survey at this time as well. This figure represents the mean across all participants of days worked in each phase, depicted by the white bars. The mean across all participants of days engaged in committed actions, depicted by the black bars. And finally, the black data points represent the mean percentage of engagement in committed actions across all phases, across all participants and all phases of the study. Contrary to what we expected, the traditional self-monitoring and baseline showed more engagement in committed actions than the subsequent phases of the study. Baseline shows a mean of 71% engagement, with 40%, 40%, and 41% across the other phases respectively. However, with these outcomes, paired with the feedback provided by the participants throughout the research, we are going back to the drawing board to extend this research with another group of participants. We also have data at the individual level that fits within the multiple baseline design, but I will not be sharing that today. In terms of acceptability of the goals, procedures, and outcomes, participants completed a questionnaire which was a rating scale from 1, strongly disagree, to 5, strongly agree. Overall, participants rated their experience in this research and the outcomes favorably. Participants reported an increase in knowledge of committed actions and a better understanding of values and how to live according to them. Despite the self-monitoring data during the EMA phases not effectively capturing the expected outcomes, the social significance is undeniable. One participant shared that their daily engagement in their chosen committed action was going for a walk after work, which led them to getting a gym membership. A senior staff who incorporates meaningful behavior such as exercise into their daily routine may experience less stress, allowing them to be more mindful and present with the support they provide colleagues and clients within the workplace. Going back to those related networks of behaviors, effective communication, a mindful senior staff with a flexible perspective may lead to more effective communication amongst their team, which has the potential to positively impact collaboration and support within said team, which may lead to more effective outcomes such as productive meetings and execution of tasks. Participants provided feedback about their experience with the EMA app, which is currently being considered for shaping the next steps of the research. Discussion has emerged about the participant pool having previous ACT exposure with the introductory workshop and the potential for future research to consider ACT-naive staff instead. A major limitation was the dichotomous variable of engaging in one committed action per day or not. Even though findings were not as hypothesized, here are some future directions based on what we learned. We will be adjusting the dichotomous variable to allow for multiple opportunities of engagement in committed actions per day. We will be broadening the timing for the EMA surveys to give participants more opportunities to report engagement in committed actions. We also learned that participants would have preferred to download the EMA app on their personal rather than work phone, so this will be the new expectation. Participants will also spend more time learning to engage with the EMA app before they are expected to do so independently. Finally, we are considering beginning participants in the baseline phase with the EMA app rather than traditional self-monitoring. With all of these learnings, we will continue this research to hopefully shift from discovery research to more programmatic research. Thank you for listening.
My name is Hannah Marlen Lübker, and I am talking about social ecological empathy and its relevance to sustainability science. And I'm doing so because it's fairly obvious that we as humanity on this planet are on a fairly unsustainable trajectory, and we really gotta make some fundamental changes. And it has been suggested that the perceived disconnect between humans and nature is a root cause of unsustainability, and many scholars advocate for reconnection. But how exactly would we do that? And so empathy is known to foster connections between humans, so one could assume that it may foster connections between humans and nature as well. And empathy is often mentioned in sustainability science literature, but more as the everyday term that we all know and use. But this shows an interest in empathy and a knowledge gap, a lack of engagement with empathy theory. And there is a wealth of research on empathy, predominantly in the fields of psychology, neuroscience, and health sciences. And so my work aims to fill this research gap by interweaving knowledge from very different research traditions, the aforementioned disciplines, and sustainability science. And so I thought it would be worthwhile to rethink how empathy could be conceptualized to be applied in a sustainability science context, specifically to bridge the perceived divide between humans and nature. Next slide, please. For my comprehensive examination, I wrote about social ecological empathy, which describes a form of empathy that can be extended beyond humans to animals, plants, and even landscapes. And of course, this concept builds on more traditional understandings of empathy, namely that empathy is an other-oriented phenomenon, which includes cognitive and affective aspects, meaning both the understanding and the sharing of another's emotions and experiences. A key pathway towards empathy is the ability to adopt the perspective of the other. And it's important that the egocentric perspective is suppressed. It's not about how you would feel in their situation. It is about how they actually feel in their situation. And experiencing empathy with other people is related to pro-social attitudes and behaviors, positive social interactions, and helping, sharing, community volunteering, you name it. Empathy with nature is related to pro-environmental attitudes and behaviors. For example, it increases interest in animal welfare and the intent to donate to environmental organizations. But as you may notice, I'm still talking about empathy for humans and empathy for nature, which is reinforcing that human-nature divide rather than bridging it. It also clashes with core assumptions in sustainability science, which is oftentimes concerned with the study of social ecological systems, which are complex adaptive systems in which humans and nature are understood to be inherently interdependent and intertwined. And thus, social ecological empathy can be understood as empathy for intertwined human-nature assemblages. This form of empathy is understood as relational, as a continuous engagement with and attunement to the experiences and emotional states of another, a collaborative, co-creative practice facilitated by the openness, trust, and responsivity of both parties. Empathy is reciprocal. It's about being in relationship with the other. Empathy requires reflection and oftentimes correction and revision as we learn about the other's experience and point of view. And so in this framing, empathy is not a special talent or something that just arises in the moment, but it's something that arises from sincere interest and a willingness to listen and to learn. And because this form of empathy emerges from relationships and interactions, it's not just an emotion or a cognition that you experience in your mind, but it is accompanied by actions, by expressions of this empathy. And this is fitting quite well, since sustainability science is inherently problem-centered and oftentimes action and solution-oriented. And so I wanted to conceptualize an empathy that can be put to work, that can be used to change our lived experience for the better. And to me, this type of empathy is quite easy to picture with animals, especially companion animals like pet dogs. It does get a little tricky with plants or even whole landscapes. They don't have emotions or inner worlds in the same way that we do, and so some people would argue that therefore we can't empathize with them. And this is where theory on embodied empathy comes into play, which is based on the idea that body and mind are not separated, but that inner experiences are embodied in our gestures and our behaviors, which can be directly perceived and thus empathized with. So plant growth or flowering or the leaves wilting and hanging down can provide the basis for empathy as it tells you about the plant's state of being. So quick recap. Social ecological empathy is a relational construct consisting of cognitive, affective, and behavioral aspects. It is situated, embodied, and practice-oriented. And I hypothesize that social ecological empathy can allow us to become aware of the web of relationships that we are always already entangled in, aware of our embeddedness in the environment. Next slide, please. Of course, my research is not purely theoretical. I am applying all these ideas in the real world, specifically in New Brunswick. I'm just showing you the map because I used to think Toronto is at the ocean, so that's New Brunswick. I've spent 4.5 months there last summer conducting a scoping study in which I tested the method that I want to use in the first study of my PhD to check whether it was feasible, whether people would want to work with it, whether it needed some adaptations, but it went quite well. I also used my time to volunteer, show up to all kinds of events, and build relationships, which culminated in a partnership with the Conservation Council of New Brunswick. My entire PhD project will be conducted in collaboration with the CCNB, which is great because I want my work to have a direct positive impact, to be useful on the ground. And CCNB will be involved in every step of the process, from planning the research project to the dissemination of results. And we have some really exciting things in store, I believe. And this mode of research is very fitting because both my bachelor's and my master's were focused on transdisciplinary collaboration. So I'm finally able to practice what I've been learning all those years. Next slide. To talk about the scoping study, we wanted to know how empathy is understood, felt, used, practiced, and lived by people who presumably have close relationships with nature. So we asked people working in environmental stewardship organizations to participate. The idea is that this will help us to truly understand empathy in this specific context, which will lay the groundwork for the second study, in which you will develop an arts-based intervention to foster empathy in the wider public. And so we did some initial interviews to talk about the participants' understanding of empathy and their relationships to nature, and how this influences or is influenced by their daily work in nature or related to nature. Then we used the photo voice method, in which people get to express their thoughts or emotions using photography. This method is great because while it is arts-based, it is quite easy and accessible. Even if people think that they have no artistic talent, which I doubt, they can still take a photo of something. It's also great if you want to express intangible, tacit, or subconscious knowledge or emotions, stuff that can't be easily put into words or might not come to mind in an interview. It's also useful to go beyond scientific knowledge to include multiple ways of knowing. The prompts that we used were, can you show us elements in nature that you feel empathy with? Self-explanatory. And the second one was, if I gave the camera to nature or to the land, what would it take pictures of? Which is supposed to foster perspective taking. And so after the participants took their photos, we sat down to have an in-depth discussion about the meaning behind their photographs, which means that you're analyzing your data collaboratively with the participants, with the intention to amplify their specific voices. And in the beginning, I was a little worried that people might not be able or too keen to talk about their feelings to a complete stranger, or that the idea of social ecological empathy would be too esoteric for people. But luckily, I was quite wrong about that. People shared such moving personal stories about their childhoods, special memories in special places, or just like life in general. It felt like a real privilege to listen to them. Next slide, please. And the pictures really speak for themselves. I mean, they're beautiful, as you can tell. And there are lots of amazing quotes from the interviews as well, such as this one, which reads, I think anytime you engage with nature, particularly in hands-on ways, you're demonstrating empathy. And because the outcomes of the photo voice exercise were so beautiful, we decided to turn them into a photo magazine to share them with others. I love a good research paper, don't get me wrong, but most people will never read one of those in their lives. So research dissemination that goes beyond scientific publications is super important if you want to be inclusive, if you want to speak to a wider audience, which of course I do. I also asked the participants whether they wanted to be credited for their work and become co-authors of this and potential future publications. I'm really trying to avoid hierarchies or distance between researchers and research subjects. I want everything to be teamwork. To me, empathy is not just the topic of my research, but also the mode in which I conduct my research, in which I engage with colleagues and all kinds of more than human collaborators. Final slide. Just to say, I will be back in New Brunswick in April to conduct the full photo voice study, and I am so looking forward to it. If you want to hear more about empathy for sustainability, or keep up with my work, or see the full photo magazine, you can do so on our website. And if you have any questions that are not answered right now, feel free to talk to me. I love talking about this stuff.
Wonderful. Thank you, Hannah, for another amazing talk. And at this point, we have a few minutes for questions. So I'm going to open the floor to questions. If you just want to raise your hand, I'll call on you. So any questions for our amazing student presenters? Ingrid, please.
Hi, thank you. Thank you, Dawn, and thank you to all three of you. These were really were amazing presentations, and just listening to them, there seemed to be a commonality in themes of well, at the high level, looking at our behavior, but looking out at how we can reach out to other human beings, and not only to human beings, but to other aspects of our common nature. And I think, you know, the empathy was a theme that I think ran through the other presentations as well. So just very impressive. And I don't want to put people on the spot, but I'm wondering if any three of you would like to maybe comment on the other paper, comment on where you might see some connections between your work and the other student presenter. Thank you.
I have one thought to add, and I think it's exploring relationships and obviously very different levels, very different perspectives, but kind of examining the effect of some event or some environmental variable on potential outcomes with respect to like parental engagement and parental behaviors with the first talk, very environmental with the last talk, and within my own kind of in a specific environment within a workplace. But I mean, it's all connected in the sense that we're looking at the effect of something in an environment that we are bringing in and exploring through the course of our research.
Wonderful. Thank you, Kristen. And if anyone doesn't have the chat on, Hannah shared her thoughts in the chat that on a very broad level, we all want to make the world a better place, even if it's just a small contribution. Any other questions for our presenters? We still have 7 minutes before our break, so we've got time to fit in some questions. Danielle.
Okay, good talks, everyone. Very interesting. So I actually have a specific question for Kristen, if that's okay, who used EMA, which, Don, you know, I used in our lab. And it's really challenging for methodology. I think you'd agree with that. So my question was, how did you navigate the challenges? What was your compliance like? And what kind of software did you use?
Yeah, so it's definitely a challenge. That was the biggest takeaway from the participant feedback, was just the whole interaction piece with the actual app. We used the application XPL, and it was a big learning curve in a way that the first participant to transition into the intervention component that involved the EMA, there was a little bit of back and forth with us because the scheduling wasn't actually proper. Like I was very open and honest with that participant in saying that they were the first person experiencing this, and this was very much so like a exploratory research in that I was learning how to do this as we kind of went along, and she was very receptive to it. So the XPOL support staff have also been very, very crucial in the entirety of my research. They were very, very responsive, very quick to respond when I had quick questions to run by them. They knew this was the first time that we were using this within the lab, so thankfully they were great in that respect. And yeah, it was definitely interesting. It was definitely the benefit, I think, is what the big part is that was focusing on when things did feel a little bit stressful in that they weren't working the way that we wanted them to work. And I think that with the knowledge and the experience that we have with the initial stage of the research, we are going to go on and be able to advance and make improvements based on the participant feedback. But yeah, long and short of it was a very big learning curve.
I don't see any right now, so I'll use moderator's privilege. And Anton, I had a question about your study, and I was wondering if you could share with us what was the most challenging part about getting involved in the study that you designed?
So I think one challenging thing is that degus are a little bit different than the common laboratory animals, like the labs and the rats and the mice. And so we had to plan like very well in advance to prepare for their breeding, because it does take significantly longer, and their weaning process is also longer and things like that. And additionally, they don't get pregnant as easily. And so even after we had paired them, it wasn't a guarantee. And so there was a lot of waiting, and we didn't know whether we wanted to proceed with the model. And at first, we were just going to take a look at the biparental kind of model and just analyze how behavior differs between mothers and fathers. And that was on the premise that if we didn't get enough pregnancies, and eventually we ended up getting more. And so that allowed us to expand our group to have the monoparental group in there as well. But yeah, I would say just working with a newer kind of species, a newer model, one that is relatively understudied as well, I think was probably the biggest challenge for me.
Great, thank you. I can see how that would both be exciting and challenging at the same time.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure.
Okay, and I see that we have a question from Karen. Karen, please go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. Anton, my question's for you, so come on back. But I wanted to say great talk by all the trainees here today. So well done, everybody. I guess, Anton, I was just wondering why or what you think the reason is that you're seeing like differential effects in the males and the females in terms of the spatial memory, that like parenting is making it worse in the males and making it better, especially in the single parent Daegu females. And then why you would have an opposite effect? Because I would have thought that like higher anxiety would be related to worse memory, but you're seeing in the males like the male parents are less anxious, but then they've got worse spatial memory. So what are your thoughts so far?
Yeah, that's a great question. And so a lot of their behaviors are really nuanced. And so we are taking a look at additional parameters that can help us make sense of their behavior a little bit more. My current idea or understanding of their behaviors, because they showed less anxiety in the elevated plus maze task, this then translates to the Barnes maze where they're not that anxious. And so as a result, when we place them on the maze, they're more exploratory. And so they don't really care to find the box because they're not anxious, and so they're just exploring. That's just what I have kind of as my understanding. And so it would be really interesting to actually now take a look at their performance on the elevated plus maze and then maybe correlate that with their Barnes maze and take a look at, are the individuals who are have a preference for the open arms actually are the ones that also make more errors on the Barnes maze task. But yeah, no, that's a great question for sure. Thank you.
Okay, thank you both. That does bring us to our scheduled break. So we have 10 minutes just set aside so everyone can get a biological break, have a chance to stretch and get a break from your space. So thank you again to our wonderful student presenters. It's been wonderful. I've seen your research at various stages across, and it was great to see your presentations. So everyone can leave stay logged in. If you just want to mute, we will reconvene in 10 minutes at 11:10.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back. I'm pleased to be able to introduce the second part of our research colloquium this morning. And before I turn to introducing our next guests, I would really like to welcome Acting Vice President Research, Michelle McGinn, and I believe she's online here to share a few words with us.
Thank you, Ingrid. I'm happy to be here this morning. Hello, everyone. I see your squares on the screen in front of me, at least. I'm really pleased to be with you today, and I appreciate being part of your celebration and hearing about some of the amazing work in the Faculty of Social Sciences. I know I had the chance to read about the presentations, and I know that you had a chance to hear at least the student presentation so far. It's important to share the research successes, as this event is really set up to do. We all get so busy in doing the work that we sometimes forget to focus on the accomplishments and all that you've done individually and collectively over the past year or more in some cases. The Social Sciences Research Colloquium enables us to take that pause to really reflect on some of the fabulous work within our midst here at Brock. This yearly gathering is a celebration of research achievements within your faculty, and it provides inspiration and encouragement for scholars at all stages of their careers, and those of us who are outside your faculty as well. Learning about our colleagues' research widens our perspectives, creates a sense of community, and can even lead to exciting new directions in scholarly work. These new directions are built on collaboration and cross-pollination that's made possible by exchanges like today's. Creating an opportunity for this to happen has been the key focus of the Social Sciences Research Colloquium since its inception in 2018, and I'm delighted that I've been able to participate in most of those sessions over the years in my role as Associate Vice President Research, and this year in my role as Acting Vice President Research. Today, we heard about the results of the collegiality by highlighting examples of outstanding student and faculty research. The three presentations by students Anton Dinh, Kristen Grant, and Hannah Marlen Lübker were exciting opportunities to hear about work in psychology, applied disability studies, and sustainability science. The three research programs advance knowledge in their respective fields while giving us fresh, innovative ways of addressing challenges of concerns to the wider society. Now, we hear a lot about the implications for the young based on conditions during pregnancy and birth in the earliest stages of development. But today, Anton shifted that focus of attention to the parents and the influence of parenting on their brains, nervous systems, and behaviors. The model that he presented of measuring spatial learning, memory, and anxiety-like behaviors in Daegu parents provides compelling perspective on the transformational experience of parenting. This research was so cutting edge that Anton was granted an opportunity to present this work at the Society for Behavioral Neuroendocrinology. And that opportunity was in part supported by his having received this FOSS Student Research Award. So that's one of the other really wonderful opportunities about the kinds of recognition here internally at Brock, that sometimes it also helps to contribute to recognition beyond our walls as well. Now, as a caring and just society, we need to support individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities to reach their full potential. Community agencies have staff who do just that, but as Kristen pointed out, these staff often experience high levels of workplace stress, which can impact the quality of care they provide to their clients. Kristen's evaluation of tools to foster engagement in committed actions has the potential to transform future training offered to the staff working within community agencies. Another critical way that our research matters is when it moves beyond our walls into community agencies and other spaces. The end result of work like this will make for happier, positive experiences and increases in well-being for the staff, which subsequently contributes to the well-being of the clients they support. And the third presentation around our planet's health is a big topic of conservation and concern in society. Record-breaking temperatures and extreme weather are among events getting us to think of how our lifestyles impact the environment. The social ecological empathy concept that Hannah put forth in her work is timely and highly insightful, and I look forward to hearing even more about that. Empathy has the potential to transform our relationships to nature, hopefully leading us to live in better harmony with the physical world around us. So my extreme congratulations, well done to Hannah, Kristen, and Anton for your work and for receiving the FOSS Student Research Award. I also extend my hearty congratulations and thanks to your advisors who shaped your research and contributed to the accomplishments that we recognize today. I see that one shout out in the chat as well, recognizing an advisor behind this work. Now, on the faculty side, I also want to extend my congratulations to Dr. Danielle Sirianni Molnar, who's a recipient of the 2023 FOSS Distinguished Researcher Award, and to Dr. Ann Farrell, who received the 2023 FOSS Early Career Researcher Award. Dr. Molnar's work makes us aware of how behavior that may look good on the surface can have incredibly destructive impacts deeper down. Exploring the perspectives of parents, teachers, and teens gives everyone involved the information they need to clear up misunderstandings. And the research paves the way for interventions to help teens caught up in the trap of perfectionism. Look forward to hearing more about the work soon. The second faculty award highlighted today focuses on another challenge experienced by many teens and others across the lifespan, which is bullying, which can have a lifelong devastating effect for victims and victimizers. Dr. Ann Farrell unravels the complexities of bullying and its links to aggression and mental health, as we will hear soon. Understanding the individual, social, and environmental contexts that contribute to bullying experiences will also help to form policies and programs to get at the root causes of this destructive behavior. To thank Dr. Farrell and Dr. Molnar for shedding light on these challenges for youth and supporting the individuals facing these challenges. I thank everyone for attending today's colloquium and for the organizers for offering us this opportunity to be informed and inspired. Thank you so much, and I turn it back to Ingrid now.
Thank you very much, Dr. McGinn. You've provided a wonderful summary of the research being done by our student presenters and also have provided a great introduction to the next two people that we're going to hear from. As Dr. McGinn mentioned, the Faculty of Social Sciences Research Excellence Award includes the Distinguished Researcher Award, and that is given to someone in recognition of work they have done in the past 5 years. The Early Career Researcher Award looks at accomplishments from the last year. Both awards require nominations as well as external and internal referees. These awards are significant because they really show how peers and internal and external experts in the field assess the work of our faculty in social sciences. I'm going to say a few words about the recipients, beginning with Dr. Ann Farrell, the 2023 Early Career Researcher Award. She was nominated by Dr. Tony Boak, who is a professor in child and youth studies, and is also the 2022 recipient of the FOSS Distinguished Researcher Award. Dr. Farrell has received over $1 million in external funding, including Tri-Council funding, a testament to her capacity to develop, engage with, and contribute to high-impact research. As of February 2024, she has had 40 peer-reviewed publications, including 9 in a single year, many of which are featured in high-ranked journals. Her innovative research looks at complex, longitudinal, quantitative snapshots of adolescent development and aggression. She is also an excellent teacher who works on and shows students how to work with statistics in child and youth studies. We are very proud to claim Dr. Farrell as an alumni of Brock University's Faculty of Social Sciences. She earned her BA in psychology, an MA in child and youth studies, and a PhD in psychology. In addition to her research accomplishments, Dr. Farrell supervises graduate and undergraduate students in the Department of Psychology and Child and Youth Studies. Our second speaker today, Dr. Danielle Molnar, the 2023 Distinguished Researcher, was nominated by Dr. Heather Chalmers, a professor and chair of Child and Youth Studies. Dr. Molnar has been recognized with a recent appointment as a Canada Research Chair Tier 2 in Adjustment and Wellbeing in Children and Youth. Her transdisciplinary research spans domains from psychology and population health sciences to biology and immunology. Her work has been funded by SSHRC, and in 2013, she completed a SSHRC-funded postdoctoral fellowship at York University. She has been a co-applicant on over $11 million in ongoing or completed external funding from agencies such as SSHRC, CIHR, and the U.S. National Institute of Health. In 2018, she was awarded the Faculty of Social Sciences Early Career Researcher Award in recognition of her achievements. She has published over 65 peer-reviewed articles, including 25 in the past 5 years. She has 8,600 citations. She has presented 85 conferences, including 19 in the past 5 years, conference presentations. In addition to these accomplishments, of course, she's also committed to mentoring and supporting students both at the graduate and the undergraduate levels. She continuously seeks innovative ways to disseminate her research, including sharing her insights through media for comment on perfectionism. She contributes to blogs and videos. She also offers school workshops on perfectionism. I'm so pleased to be able to introduce the two of them. We will hear from Dr. Anne Farrell first, followed by Dr. Danielle Molnar, and then we will have some time for comments and questions.
Thank you so much for having me here today and having the opportunity to present my research. And thank you for that introduction as well. It's been great to hear all of the student presentations, and I'm excited for the discussions. So my presentation is on my research so far on understanding adolescent bullying and trying to understand a variety of different factors, individual, social, and environmental factors that could all contribute to adolescent bullying perpetration. Next slide, please. So bullying is the systematic abuse of power. So it's when someone has greater power, whether that's psychological or social or physical, and they are taking advantage of this power and harming someone else for their own self-gain. So the self-gain could be anything ranging from like material resources to having more social status or social dominance. And this is a behavior that we see that peaks in prevalence during the adolescent age period, suggesting that there's something going on developmentally and contextually that could be contributing to bullying during adolescence. But we also know that this has long-term implications for the continued use of aggression and violence in the future for those who are perpetrating, but also for adverse mental health outcomes for those who are targeted. Next slide, please. So I think it's also important to understand the context of bullying in Canada. We see that the rates of bullying have been pretty high in Canada and relatively stable in the last decade. So this is a figure from the UNICEF 2020 report, and amongst 38 economically advanced countries, we see that Canada is rating in the bottom third, meaning that they have higher prevalence rates, at least relative to these other countries. So we can see in the figure, Canada is rating at 23 out of 38, with a 20% prevalent rate, meaning that 1 in 5 children and youth in Canada are saying that they are being bullied often. So that suggests that there's something that might be happening in our society that could be contributing to these relatively stable and high rates of bullying in our society. So I hope to be able to kind of understand some of these factors that might be contributing to the rates that we see in Canada. Next slide, please. So my overarching research program is aimed at looking at the different factors that contribute to bullying. And the reason why I've been looking at this, and in particular on the bullying perpetration side, so youth who are using these behaviors, is because I think that the better we have an understanding of some of the contexts that contribute to bullying perpetration, then maybe those are the factors that we can target to make prevention and intervention efforts more effective. So the theoretical framework that I have been using, next slide, please, is Bronfenbrenner's ecological model. So similar framework as the last student presentation that we saw today. And I like this model because it is a complex model and it tries to capture a range of different factors that can contribute to child development. And when applied to bullying, I think that it's important to understand all of the individual characteristics of a developing child who is at the center. And this can range from characteristics like, of course, their age or gender, but also individual differences in personality traits. We know that not all young people are the same. So trying to get an understanding of these individuals, but also recognizing that they are nested within their immediate social environments or the microsystem. So this would be like what's going on with their families at home, how are they interacting with their teachers or peers at school. And then these environments are then nested in broader and larger environments like the neighborhood, for example, which is an indirect setting. And at the largest level, the macrosystem and chronosystem, we can start to see maybe some societal and cultural values that might be shaping what's happening at the school or what's happening at home, both directly and indirectly. So I hope that for my research, I can capture just a little piece of this complex model to gain an understanding of individual social and environmental factors. So one of the individual factors that I have focused on in some of my research are individual differences in personality. Next slide, please. So we see that the larger literature on personality and bullying perpetration shows that generally on average, youth who are using bullying behaviors are also on average higher on antisocial personality traits. And we see this across a range of different personality traits. So things like being higher on exploitativeness or being higher on manipulativeness or callousness and being lower on empathy. And that makes sense in the sense that on average, maybe people who are higher on these types of tendencies would be more likely to kind of take advantage of others for their own self-gain. But I also recognize that these average patterns don't represent everyone, and there could be subgroups of young people that experience unique patterns. Next slide, please. So we might see that there are people who are higher on both bullying and these personality traits, but it's possible that some youth might be higher on these traits and not engaging in bullying, or maybe they are engaging in bullying, but they might not necessarily be higher on these traits. And there's definitely going to be youth who are low on both. So the first study I wanted to present is capturing this idea that there are unique patterns of development for both bullying and personality traits. And I was curious to see how these would both relate to one another across adolescent development, so across time. And the focus of the first study was on looking at hypercompetitiveness as the personality trait. Next slide, please. So hypercompetitiveness is a specific type of personality trait that captures this tendency to win at all costs. So it's really competing to win as opposed to competing to excel in a certain domain or area. And so the idea that we had for this study was, well, if people are more competitive and they're trying to compete with others to win against them, then maybe they would be more likely to use bullying as a strategy in order to accomplish this. So the data for this study came from the McMaster Teen Study, which is a longitudinal study based out of U Ottawa, led by Dr. Tracy Feincourt. And we looked at a sample of 600 adolescents who provided data on bullying and hypercompetitiveness every year from grade 7 to grade 12. And we were trying to see what those unique patterns could look like across adolescents in both bullying and hypercompetitiveness. So first, I'll present the data for the groups that we found for bullying. Next slide, please. And the good news was that the majority of young people, so about 82%, were relatively low and decreasing in bullying perpetration across grade 7 to grade 12. So that's represented by the green line there. So from grade 7 to grade 12, they were low and they were decreasing. And we found a smaller group of 18% of youth were high and stable in bullying across grade 7 to grade 12. So it seems that it is a smaller group of individuals who are the ones that are consistently using bullying and that they were relatively stable across adolescence. So then we tried the same approach to see were there subgroups of hypercompetitiveness that we could also find. Next slide, please. And we found 3 groups for hypercompetitiveness. So we found about 10% were low and stable, again represented by the green line. And we found around 47% were moderate and stable, represented by the orange line across adolescence. And then we found 42% were high and increasing in hypercompetitiveness from grade 7 to 12, represented by the blue line. So there was a group of individuals who were actually increasing in hypercompetitiveness across adolescence. And I was really curious to know if those who were increasing were also the same individuals who were high on bullying as well. So we looked at these groups together across bullying and hypercompetitiveness. And next slide, please. And we found that it was only 9% of youth who were both high on bullying and high on hypercompetitiveness. So it did represent a smaller group, but I was curious to know, so among those who were high on bullying and competitiveness, like what really separated them from their peers who maybe were not as high in bullying or who were not as high in competitiveness. And what we found was that those who were in this group, this high bullying, high competitiveness group, reported that they perceived poorer climates at their school and poorer family functioning at home as well. So I think this was important in my understanding because, of course, individual differences are important. So how their own individual personalities impact their behavior is important, but at the same time, that environmental context is also going to be important. So if we know what's happening at school and at home, maybe those are also areas that we can target for prevention efforts as well. So beyond the school and family or the immediate context, I was also curious to see what additional social and environmental context could contribute to bullying in addition to personality as well. Next slide, please. So in this study, we looked at a cross-sectional sample of almost 400 adolescents from the Brock Adolescent Development Study. And this was with Dr. Tony Volk, also at Brock in Child and Youth Studies. And we looked at this cross-sectional sample, and we were curious to see if we can capture additional social and environmental contexts alongside personality to see if it impacted or contributed to the use of bullying. Next slide, please. And on average, the pattern that we found was that really these contexts from multiple systems were all meaningful. So first, we see personality was important and consistent with previous findings as well. So we found that lower honesty humility, which is a personality trait that captures a tendency to be more exploitative, was related to bullying. We also found that poorer parenting quality was also related to bullying, but we found that additional interactive effects of social environments were also important. So how much social influence someone had, or the interaction between teachers and students in the context of school discipline, in particular poor quality discipline, as well as perceiving more competition at school among peers, all contributed to bullying. And also perceptions of higher neighborhood violence also contributed to bullying as well. So again, I think this is showing that it's important to consider multiple contexts and how they work alongside one another, but also how they might interact to contribute to bullying perpetration as well. So I was curious to see more about these larger social and environmental contexts, which led to a recent systematic review. Next slide, please. That we conducted this year that's currently under review, where I was just curious to see where the state of the research was on these larger social and environmental contexts. So we reviewed how many studies in the last 10 years or so used the social ecological perspective to understand bullying, and we identified 72 studies. Interestingly, among those, there were only 4 studies that looked at the Canadian context. And one of the more prominent findings was that 70%, so most of the studies, were really focused on those immediate micro system factors. So things happening at home or at school, which definitely makes sense. They're very important settings for children and youth. But at the same time, there were not that many studies focused on more macro, systemic, or cultural factors that could contribute to bullying, at least in the context of studies using quantitative methods. So it seems like that might be an important area that we would want to target in future studies. Also, only half of the studies looked at interactions among these factors, meaning that they were primarily looking at the individual effects of
like parenting or school without thinking about how they might also interact with one another to contribute to bullying experiences. So in my more recent studies, I've been trying to address this and thinking about ways that we could try to measure these larger macro factors and see how it could impact individual level aggression and bullying behavior. Next slide, please. So in a recent pilot study that we conducted, we tried to address this limitation in a sample of 475 young adults recruited from the university. And they provided self-reports on their personality and their aggressive behavior. Specifically, we looked at indirect aggression because it is the more common form of aggression we would see among young adults. And we know that bullying looks different outside of the high school context. But we also asked for their home postal codes when they were growing up, with the idea that we can link this to Statistics Canada data about the region in which they grew up to try to target more of those macro level factors. So does what's happening in that larger environment or region or neighborhood impact what could potentially be happening at the individual level with aggressive behavior? So I've only just started looking at this data. So the results that I'm presenting are really preliminary correlations that I would like to learn a little bit more about, but I thought it would be nice to present those today. Next slide, please. And what we found were small effects, but we did find that aggressive behavior was related to several regional indicators. In particular, we found that aggression was associated with higher number of visible minorities in a region and higher number of immigrants in a region, as well as higher post-secondary completion, and then higher mobility as well. So meaning more people are moving in and out of that region. So again, I think this is pointing to the fact that we need to pay attention to those larger macro factors of what's happening in society, because we know that individual youth are nested within schools, which are nested within neighborhoods and larger regions that could have both direct or indirect associations with individual level behavior. So I would like to really look at this in more depth in future studies, try to replicate this with larger samples of youth in the context of bullying specifically. But the idea here is like, if we can understand these larger factors, these larger things happening in our society, maybe that's what we can try to target to take a more preventative approach that would not only reduce bullying, but also reduce the adverse mental health outcomes that could be associated with bullying as well. So I wanted to present an example of what these possibilities or implications could be. So as an example, for the next study, next slide, please. So this is one of the examples that I was kind of thinking of. So this is a study that we did during the fall of 2020. So during the pandemic, the paper came out earlier this year. So in this study, schools were randomized to answer, or schools were randomly assigned, but students had to answer about their bullying experiences and mental health either before the pandemic or during the pandemic in the fall of 2020, which is when the data were collected. So the fall of 2020 was when students went back to school in person. So they were back to school in person, but we know that that looked differently than what would traditionally what it would look like in the school setting. So for example, the classroom sizes could have been smaller, definitely more teachers and educators were supervising students, mainly for the effects of reducing the spread of the virus. So like social distancing, enforcing like hand washing, masking, that kind of thing. So we know that it looked different. So we were curious to see what bullying and mental health as a result of being bullied would look like during that pandemic versus before the pandemic. Next slide, please. And what we found was that victimization, specifically bullying victimization, was significantly lower during the pandemic compared to before the pandemic, and also mental health difficulties as a result of being victimized. So they were specific to the context of victimization were also significantly lower during the pandemic compared to before the pandemic. And then we looked at their correlations as well. So we know that generally victimization is related to mental health difficulties, and we were curious to see if these correlations were also changing in the pandemic condition to before the pandemic. Next slide, please. And what we found was that these correlations were significantly lower during the pandemic compared to before the pandemic. So they were still related. So those who were saying that they experienced victimization were still reporting mental health difficulties, but the strength of that association was significantly lower during the pandemic compared to before the pandemic for the overall sample. But we also saw this specifically in girls and among secondary students. So I think kind of the takeaway of this study is that we can see that what's happening in larger society, in this example, within the context of the pandemic, was impacting what's happening in the school setting where students are, and that in turn was able to impact the prevalence rates of victimization and mental health difficulties as well. So if anything, I guess one silver lining of the pandemic is we can see that it's first possible that bullying can decrease. And in fact, this was the lowest or the biggest decrease that we have seen in Ontario with respect to bullying prevalence rates. But at the same time, I think it's showing that when you potentially reduce bullying, you can also potentially reduce mental health difficulties in youth as well. So maybe there's something that we can learn from this this pandemic and maybe try to take components of what was effective in reducing the pandemic. So maybe having more educator supervision and really focusing on building more positive relationships could contribute to reductions in the pandemic, reductions in bullying behavior. Next slide, please. So I think the broader implications are that if we understand what contributes to bullying, then maybe we can use that as a preventative method to try to reduce it, and potentially reducing bullying perpetration could be one way to reduce mental health difficulties in youth, knowing that, of course, there are many factors that contribute to mental health difficulties as well. But I think this big kind of takeaway is focusing on building more positive social relationships that focus on building a sense of belonging and community for children and youth, so that we can kind of prevent the need for even using bullying behavior in the first place. Next slide, please. And my final kind of takeaways for this is hopefully going to inform my future research in understanding how individual factors interact with these social and environmental factors. So knowing that not all young people are the same and they don't respond to the different environments or social relationships in the same way. So how do they interact? And also focusing more on these macro regional factors to see how they impact what's happening more immediately within these micro factors. And I'm also really curious to see if the relevance of these factors change across development. So how does what's happening earlier in adolescence impact what's happening later on, and then also potentially during young adulthood and across the lifespan? Next slide, please. So finally, I just wanted to acknowledge all of my collaborators and colleagues who I work really closely with at Brock in the BRAVE group, as well as at U Ottawa, and then all the wonderful students I've had the chance to work with at Brock as well, and all the funders. And next slide, please. That's it. Thank you.
So first, I just want to thank Anne and for all the students' dynamite talks so far. I'm going to switch gears. We're going to talk about perfectionism, which most people, I think, would agree is a virtue in society. And this was never made more clear to me than when a parent pretty well chased me into a high school parking lot after I did a workshop on perfectionism with grade 12 students, and basically told me I had no right to try and make her child less ambitious, that my talk was nonsense about perfectionism. How could I try and, discourage that in young people? And in all fairness, you can see her point to some extent, because who doesn't want a highly driven teen who's meticulous, who's constantly pushing themselves to be better, right? Fair enough. But I want to, if I told you, and this is what I told her, think about this. If the research is telling us that this is quietly pretty well dismantling and destroying the lives of 1 in 3 teens, do you still feel that way? I'll leave that with you, because today what I want to do is take a pause and for us to really question whether perfectionism and pushing teens to the brink to get success is really a good strategy. So we'll take it from there. So, what is perfectionism? At its most basic, it's requiring perfection from the self and or others. One thing to be clear, it's not conscientiousness. So it's not striving for excellence. It's not being planful or organized, things like that. And there's tons of conceptualizations. The thing is, all of these conceptualizations have been driven by adults. So research for years and years and years was done on convenient samples of young adults for a while, then it went to full adults, and teens and kids were pretty well ignored. So in our lab, I've been fascinated by teenagers for a long time, not just because I'm a parent to 2, but I just find that developmental period because there's so much change so quickly, and not only are people changing biologically rapidly, but their whole environments are changing and their relationships are changing. So I was like, what do teens think about this? How do they define it? How do they experience it? And when you look at the kind of early work on perfectionism in teens, all they did basically was take adult models that had already been established and then use those to understand teens. And, my lab and I, we would talk about this a lot with students. Is that a fair thing to do? Like, will these adult models, is it fair to assume that's the way teens are experiencing it? So basically, we said, we're not going to do that. We're going to pretend we know nothing about the topic. And we're going to take a bottom-up approach and ask teens themselves, what is it? How do you experience it day to day? And for those of you who know me, I've been trained my whole life in quantitative methods. I absolutely love statistics, numbers. If you tell me your phone number, your birth date, I will remember it for life. I'm a numbers person, but I won't remember your name, chances are. So it shows where my head is. So it's a big step for me to do qualitative work, which, again, I didn't have any experience with, but we really thought to kind of truly understand what's going on with teens, we needed to take a multi-method, multidisciplinary approach. So basically, I collaborated with some wonderful people who do collaborative work, one of which is at this talk, Don Zinga. And we did some in-depth interviews with teens. And we basically asked them, what does perfectionism mean to you? What does it look like in your day-to-day life? And their answers were really, really interesting. And while some of it did overlap with the adult literature, some of it didn't. So what did we find? So basically they define perfectionism as having 11 different components. And I want to make it clear, not all components are relevant to all teens, but when you look across them, you start seeing this beautiful mosaic emerge, right? So the first one, this maps on to what we know about adults. They have high standards. Now, a lot of people will say, well, what's wrong with high standards? Absolutely nothing. As a parent, I push high standards in my house, right? However, these aren't just high standards. These are often impossible, out of this world expectations. So things like, we had one teen, I'm consciously aware of the fact that it's impossible to be perfect. So it's not just being great, it's being perfect, but I still try to get there anyways. So they know I can't reach it, but I'm going to keep pushing myself anyways. Here's the thing, when they're pushing themselves towards these extraordinary standards, even when they come close, or in some cases, they actually reach them, they're miserable. They all tell us this. They get there and they're saying, even if I do get that top award, even if I do get the grade I want, even if I do get the number of goals in a game that, was my goal for the day, they're not happy. They tend to do one of two things. Either they discount the accomplishment. So they'll say, yeah, but now that I think about it, it really wasn't that big of a deal to get there. Or they'll basically say, it wasn't that important to begin with. I have to move on and raise the bar. And I've actually seen this as an instructor, not just as a researcher. When I taught third-year stats, both in psych and in CHIS, I'd have students who they're just praying for this 90, this magical 90. I don't know why 90. They would get it. And then they would say to me, I'm expecting celebrations. And they were like, the exam, now that I think about it, was actually easier than I thought. And I'm like, no, average was like 55, but okay. And so you'll see they use these discounting principles. And basically what's happening is they're discounting to make sure that they stay motivated to keep pushing and pushing. So what underlies this kind of way of being in this world? Well, the teens tell us it's not that they're running towards success. Essentially, they're running away from failure. And they basically are walking around in life feeling insecure and feeling, I always when I talk to young people, I say it's almost as if they have an empty core. So they want other people to fill it up. And it's the idea of they're not good enough. They're not worthy of love. They're not worthy of acceptance. They're not worthy of anything good in this world unless they're perfect. And again, that's probably one of the biggest things that affects me, because these people, again, they tend to be praised for having this way of being. And yet they're walking around miserable and sad and feeling empty most of the time. So when a parent comes to me and they're like, hey, like, do you want my child lazy? Do you want my child this way? And of course, the answer is no, because the opposite of perfectionism is not laziness, is not a motivation. You can be conscientious. You can still strive for excellence without the weight of the perfectionism on your shoulders. This brings me to another point. A lot of people, I always tell students in my lab, I'll correct them when they say that they're striving. And I'll say, when we're talking about perfectionism, I don't think that's a really accurate word to use, because it makes it sound like they're choosing and they're like running towards success, right? Teens tell us it's a compulsion. They have to be this way, even when they don't want to be this way. They feel they have to. And that links to the previous point. They feel insecure, empty, without kind of keeping pushing all the time. So they'll say, like this person here, they physically shut down and start crying if things don't go well. We've had other people tell us it's like having an angry voice on their shoulder, constantly saying, you're not good enough. Come on, push, push, push. Another really complexity of perfectionism is this constant push and pull. We call it drawn in and repelled, where a lot of young people, they feel pushed towards this, I need to be perfect, I need to be perfect. But then when they experience any kind of obstacle, failure, any kind of mistake, they shut down and they're repelled by it and they run away. So it's quite a paradox. And you can imagine how busy it is up here in their heads, right? In the adult literature, they often talk about there's different forms, both intra and interpersonal aspects. When most people think of perfectionism, they think of the intrapersonal aspects. So people who create these impossible standards for themselves and are really punitive when things don't go well for them. But there's also interpersonal aspects. A lot of the teens we talk to, it's not that they're pushing themselves so much all the time. They feel others expect them to be perfect. And they'll say things like, doesn't matter what I do, I'm never going to measure up. And we know this, it's called socially prescribed perfectionism. We know that this is one of the most destructive forms. And it makes sense because it's associated with hopelessness and helplessness. Like you're kind of removing the control, right? So just something to think about that replicates in young people. This one's different. A lot of people think order and organization are part of perfectionism. In adults, is tangential at best. In teens, this is a big thing for them, where they have to have certain schedule. So this person here, they have this day plan. If they don't follow it to a T, they feel like their whole day's been destroyed, that they're a bad person. Because remember, it's not just about the products, it's about them as human beings. So their productivity reflects who they are inside. And one of the things, my collaborators and students and I have been chatting about, it makes sense order and organization would be more prominent in adolescents because they have less control of their lives compared to adults. So organizing their room, organizing their notes, doing their schedule, that's one of the few things they do have control over. So it makes sense perfectionism would be more prominent and manifest there. It's all in my head. So this theme basically is about the self-criticism. these teens are mean to themselves. If anyone talked to someone else in front of us, we'd probably be offended by the things we'd hear. So if I was to say some of the things they say of themselves in the hallways at Brock, people would probably stop and be like, what? Like, what's going on with her? And yet they constantly have this negative internal dialogue where it's like, they make a mistake. I'm such an idiot. I'm so stupid. Why would I do that? I'm such a loser. Like, imagine saying that to somebody else, right? And yet it's natural for them to constantly say that to themselves. One that's really unique to adolescents, again, not so prevalent in adults, is the role of social comparison. This makes sense given the developmental period of adolescence, where they often use others as mirrors to determine kind of where they are in their school. So, looking at rankings for grades, looking at who gets chosen for teams, popularity contests, things like that. And so this was very prominent where a lot of the ways when they're trying to figure out if they've reached their goal, it's not so much absolute terms, because what really is perfection, aside from grades where you can get like 100%, but even that, by the way, isn't perfect, because if there's bonus marks and they don't get those, it's not perfect. So, but when you don't have kind of objective criteria, they often look to others. So am I the best? Am I doing better than others? And it actually kind of dovetails with what Anne was saying about hypercompetitiveness. So a lot of teen perfectionists, I guarantee, would score quite highly on hypercompetitiveness. And then the two other themes that really emerge from this work is the perfect front. This is quite dangerous, I would say, because the idea here is they put on this mask of perfection. So again, no one's lives are perfect. That's a given. But they like to give the air to everyone that it is. And why it's dangerous, it precludes these teens from getting help. It precludes them from going out. And one of my colleagues, Paul Hewitt, who is a clinical psychologist and also a researcher at UBC, I can't tell you the number of requests he has to provide psychological autopsies. And this is basically trying to explain to parents and loved ones who've lost someone by suicide what happened, because they didn't see it coming. And by and large, when he does these, the person was an extreme perfectionist, and you read journals and you see what's going on behind the scenes. They were just masters of hiding their struggles. So I really work hard in the schools to help teachers and parents understand the signs, just because it's so easy to miss. And then finally, reactivity, a lot of emotion. So behind this, so when they do make a mistake, they tend to be highly reactive. It's the worst thing in the world. They overgeneralize, and they catastrophize. So that's what teens tell us. The other things I want to highlight about teens is they were so insightful. I am so incredibly impressed with the young people we talk to. They're very self-aware, they're very well-spoken, and they know a lot about what's going on. So this idea that, a lot of people tend to think adults know so much more than teens, that's not at all the case in the young people we've been talking to. Clearly, it's complicated. It doesn't look like one thing, so it's not one size fits all. And that's really important, that the teens wanted us to know, hey, we're individuals, right? So then we asked teachers, like, what are you seeing? And again, I'm not going to get into the specific methodology, but I love talking about it, so feel free if you have questions. But we did this large longitudinal study across 3 time points. It was multi-method, where everyone got the survey at 3 time points, and then a subsample did interviews at all 3 time points of teachers. And we basically want to know a few things. What do they think about perfectionism in young people? And what strategies do they use? So I'm going to focus on just the first part. So, we recruited them across Southern Ontario. The surveys, they were about 40 minutes to do. Interviews were anywhere from 60 to 90 minutes. They had a lot to say, which was great. In the end, we had 197 teachers, mostly women, mostly elementary school teachers, and a wide variety of teaching experience. I just want to note these numbers are very representative of the teaching profession in Ontario. So one of the things we asked was, and I'm just going to focus on this very, very tiny part of the study. We asked, how advantageous versus disadvantageous do you think perfectionism is for your students, right? And I just want to show you, because to me, these results, they still blow my mind every time. So we said, in general, how advantageous versus disadvantageous. And there's the numbers, right? So if you look at the bottom, most teachers were mixed. They're like some advantages, some disadvantages. But when you go between those who said it was disadvantageous versus advantageous, you see still more teachers thought it was a good thing versus a bad thing. Then we went in specific domains. So we're like, okay, tell us about student achievement. By and large, students or teachers thought this was perfectionism's advantageous for students. So over half of the sample are like, great thing. I just want to put a caveat on this. This is survey data. When we talk to teachers in the interviews, we never ask this question. But what was fascinating is most of the interview was permeated with teachers complaining how perfectionism held students back because they were afraid to be evaluated. They would often hand things in late. They required so much validation and additional structure to get things done. So I found it interesting that when you flat out ask them, they're like, yes, it's great. But then when you don't ask them and they're talking about perfectionism in students, they actually talk about a lot of the negatives. Mental health, you can see very clearly here, teachers recognize the mental health costs of perfectionism. So 73% are like not great. Student relationships, so how does it affect their relationships with their peers, their families? Most said it was mixed, but clearly more saw issues with it than others. I can tell you in the interviews, a lot talked about how perfectionistic students really struggle in group work because they either take right over discounting other people's contributions, or they don't want to work in groups at all and they just insist on doing it on their own. So that was one of the things they did talk about. And even physical health, which I didn't think the teachers would really pick up on. Wow, did they ever? So 50% saying it was disadvantageous for physical health. So we kind of were like, are they right? What's going on? How come in general, most said it was mixed? And yet when you look at the other issues, they're pretty well negative. So the way we kind of interpreted this data is that teachers are weighing whatever advantages they think there are to perfectionism for academic achievement far more than the mental, physical health costs and the cost to relationships. It's almost like they're saying, like, when you ask them in general, is perfectionism a good thing for kids? They'll say more often than not, yeah, but it's because they're putting more weight on that achievement. So, we're like, are they right? What's going on with these young people? So we've done tons of work on perfectionism and mental health. And I can tell you overwhelmingly, research shows perfectionism is a vulnerability factor for higher levels of anxiety, higher levels of depression, disordered eating, and a host of other mental health issues. Relationships. There's a whole model called the perfectionism social disconnection model, which posits that perfectionism, it undermines relationship quality and social support because these people are either hyper competitive, so they turn a lot of people off, or they keep to themselves because they're so afraid of being rejected and hurt. What about physical health? Well, perfectionism is not good for physical health either. They are chronically stressed. We know stress over chronic time periods, it undermines a host of issues in the body. So we found it was associated with higher levels of inflammation over a period of time. We know it's related to poor self-reported health as well. So what about academics? Because that's the key thing where I think sometimes when parents, they get a little nervous about what I'm going to talk to their teens about, it's this. They think that if they lose the perfectionism, that they're not going to be as successful. We've done work on this. And bottom line is, like, we've studied a host of youth. This is just one study. And I'll just skip to the bottom line. So we did random intercept cross-leg models. So we had 4 time points across first-year university into second-year university, just basically seeing how does perfectionism change, how does academic achievement change, and how does perfectionism predict changes in academic achievement, how does academic achievement predict changes in perfectionism. And the bottom line is simple. Self-oriented perfectionism, those who have high standards for themselves and are self-punitive, small increment in academic achievement. So, okay, the parents might have something, but it's not astronomical by any means. It was just like really tiny effect size. Socially prescribed perfectionism, when you believe other people expect perfection from you, lower achievement. And the funny thing is, the more these young people achieved, the higher levels their perfectionism got, meaning it's that raise the bar effect. So the better I do, the better I'm expected to do. So just a couple of things to finish up. One of the things in this research area that boggles my mind is how siloed research is. So basically you have in psychology, you have these individual labs doing their own work. Not a lot of people are talking to each other. And we have kind of these false walls, right? Like I'm developmental, I'm health, I'm neuro. And it's like you don't talk to the people, even in different streams of psychology. More so, there's other areas of research that examine these types of topics, like in sociology, in health sciences, and people aren't talking to each other, which I think is really holding everybody back. The other thing you'll see when you look across my work, certainly when you look across the broader field, relatively homogeneous samples. So what you generally see are samples that are characterized as female, white, middle, upper class. Is it fair to take our to take these samples, make generalizations to everybody else? I would argue no. And then finally, monomethod, where you see a lot of, and again, my own work, I do this, so it's not criticism, but there's a lot of self-report, single report, cross-sectional, more and more people moving into studying over time, longitudinal, which is nice, but rarely blending different methodologies. So the other thing we see is it's monodisciplinary. So psych, it's like if any of you have seen the movie Alien, where the alien comes out of the belly, it's like perfectionism's living in you as some entity, it's inside. Really focused on the individual. Gender, race, class differences largely overlooked, and it's primarily quantitative. However, what's fascinating, my next door neighbor in my department, Shauna Pomerantz, she studies girlhood studies. She's a sociologist. And I read her book called Smart Girls. And all of chapter 2, when I read it, I lost it. So I'm like, oh my God, you study perfectionism. She's like, what's that? And I'm like, what do you mean, what's that? And they don't use the word at all in the book. But the themes and what she studies is so similar to what we did, but no one, again, was talking to each other. So girlhood studies is a sociocultural approach, and they study supergirls, top girls, future girls, so on and so forth. But they look at different, instead of it being inside a person, they're looking at the broader society and kind of how is this impacting how people are kind of navigating the world, perceiving what's going on? And I found that fascinating because their work's primarily qualitative. So we were like, why don't we bridge this? Why don't we start doing work collaboratively? Because these two approaches complement each other so beautifully. And that's what we've done. So our first thing we've done, kind of charting this new course, is we wrote a theory paper highlighting commonalities between girlhood studies and psychological focuses on perfectionism, or at least themes that kind of fall under that umbrella from a psychological term. And the next thing we're going to do, we've already collected data from 1,000 young people in the United States, step one, that from a nationally representative sample, to see if there's race, class, and gender differences, and differences with respect to sexual orientation. Because again, we're trying to break the mold and not assume that the findings we have thus far are applicable to everyone. So I'll end it there. And the other thing I just want to point out is I thank everyone for this award, but really I'm just the face. None of this would be possible without all the wonderful students I work with, collaborators I work with, and also the funding that allows this work to take place. So thank you.
Thank you so much to both of you. This is really incredible. I was really struck by how our new Brock strategic plan, some of the things we highlight, curiosity, creativity, courage, they really are exemplified here in all of these talks. I heard the word so much. I'm curious about how this works. I'm curious why people say this. I'm curious how we behave this way or that. Clearly, the creativity is really is striking. Trying to put things together in different ways, looking at different kinds of methods of getting information, and the courage. Really striking. It takes courage to sort of challenge the understandings in your discipline. It takes courage to suggest that when it comes, to bullying, maybe we need to look at things like regions, and it takes courage to, I think, put those things together. People may say, when you're highlighting things like post-secondary and visible minorities, isn't that sort of challenging our assumptions about what we think bullying is related to? Or Danielle, I think really struck by what you said, sort of, the siloed work we do, or assumptions about gender and race that are built into our research. I mean, making those things takes courage, because they're really challenging how we've done research in the past few years. So, and of course, I'm struck by our student presenters, and you can really see how having amazing faculty, amazing graduate supervisions, and relaying those qualities is just doing wonderful things for our students. So I wanted to say those things, and I'm going to turn it over to moderate the comments. I would really wanted to thank all of you for this, but I'm going to turn it over to Dawn, who our Associate Dean Grad Research, who I don't know where she finds the time to do all of this amazing stuff. So, Dawn, if you, I'll turn it to you to moderate the comments and closing remarks. But this is thank you so much, everyone.
Thanks, Ingrid. As Ingrid mentioned, we do have a few minutes for questions. So if anyone in the audience has questions, please just raise your hand and I'll call on you. So any questions for our two amazing faculty presenters who I'm sure have given you lots to think about? Tony, please go ahead.
Yeah, thanks for the great talks for the students and for the faculty presenters. And I'll save questions for when we get together another time. Great presentation. Danielle, another link you add to perfectionism that might be more serious is it might be wiping out the human species. Evidence from looking at global fertility rates suggests that there's a trend that is ongoing and accelerating for people to have fewer and fewer kids. And the data shows that it's almost entirely being driven by women's decisions and women's competition. So in other words, one of the best forms of birth control is getting a PhD, right? Because you have to compete so much to get where you want to be as a competitive species. And for women, this runs up against the issue of reproduction. So it's a really huge issue when we talk about this competitiveness and drive to succeed. So what do you see, or what do we know about these teenage perfectionists when they become young adults? Right? Are they holding off having kids? Are they passing this on to their kids? Is their mental health issues getting worse as they get older? So developmentally, what's happening as they move beyond adolescence? So it's not just about, is your teen suffering now, but are you setting them up for being the hyper competitive dance moms, et cetera, for the next 40 years of their lives?
Yeah, no, thank you. That's such a great question. Yeah, what we see is it definitely does get worse. It blossoms. And I'm sure you've seen Jennifer Twingy's work on how individualism's really driving the decision to have fewer kids or less kids. Clearly, me getting a PhD did not work for birth control because I got two. But I can see that the individualism associated with perfectionism, it makes sense that that would be a driver towards that. Because again, one of the things I didn't mention is young people who are highly perfectionistic, and this pervades adulthood as well, they tend to be highly self-focused, which is one of the reasons it's so associated with depression, because when you're constantly within your own head, it just exacerbates, keeps ruminations going, so on and so forth. That's also a driver of lower fertility rates. The other issue why that could definitely be a plausible explanation, what you're saying, is they have very difficult, often tumultuous relationships. So the idea is when they're so perfectionistic, a couple of things happen. Number one, the hyper-competitiveness, their focus is often elsewhere. Number two, they tend to annoy people around them and turn them off because they can often come off as abrasive. So just because, think about it this way, you'll hear a lot of teens say this and adults, I'll hurt you before you get a chance to hurt me. They're always expecting people to come at them, to reject them, to hurt them. So their best way to kind of combat that preemptively is either build walls or attack first. So you do see high levels of social disconnection, which can pervade the romantic relationships quite easily. And some of the research among adults with romantic couples shows that they can also be very competitive in their relationship itself, which can cause some problems, right? So yeah, great question.
There's also a question in the chat for Danielle from Kristen. I'm wondering what your perspective is on the relation of interdependence versus independence and the relations of these constructs with perfectionism.
Yeah, another good question. So this one's tricky because both are issues. So if I'm understanding the question right, and if I'm not, correct me. So for independence, again, this idea of isolating the self, trying to protect oneself on the one hand, but then what teachers tell us, which is really interesting, is when they're really young, they're quite codependent and intervening with, like, so when they get an assignment, for example, teachers will tell us one of the ways they know a student's perfectionistic is they panic as soon as they're given a new task, the hand goes up and it's, okay, explain it to me again. Every time they write a word, a sentence, is this right? Is this right? And you see a lot of codependence that way. The other thing is we see a lot of self-selection in their peer groups. So perfectionists tend to hang out with other perfectionists. In a weird way, it's kind of creating this codependency within the group, but they're so hyper competitive with each other, the group actually becomes quite toxic. You'll see a lot of drama. They tend to tear each other down more than lift each other up, but it creates this codependency at the same time where they can't seem to separate from each other either. So I'm not sure if that answers the question. If it doesn't, please ask in a different way. I won't be offended.
It does. I was also just wondering kind of around the interdependence in that, like, if someone is raised in a household where it's praised and promoted to be reliant on other people, not reliant, but just to lean on people and lean on your supports when you need something, or it's just easier to kind of reach an end goal when you have support along the way versus a household that is like, you're going to do this and you're going to do this on your own and put your head down and kind of trudge through until you accomplish your goal. So I think that's kind of, I don't know if that, if what I'm saying makes sense, but I was just wondering if there was any sort of literature or research with respect to like that sort of dynamic and how that fosters into young adulthood.
Yeah, not specifically that, but what I can tell you is a lot of the research looking at the developmental antecedents of perfectionism, there's a couple of dialogues, some which might surprise you. So one is, it's called the social reaction model. And basically the idea is perfectionism is a coping mechanism that results from adverse childhood experiences. So the idea is one way it can develop is actually in these adversarial, difficult, chaotic households. And the idea is these kids take this on because they're like, if I'm perfect, I'm not going to get hurt. People leave me alone. I can kind of manage. And it's like a survival strategy, right? Another way is if the parent's perfectionistic, the idea is social modeling. There is research on that, but I question it. And I'll tell you why. It's not the veracity of the researchers who've done it. They're great at what they do, but the research is retrospective from adulthood and it's cross-sectional. So I don't necessarily buy into that, because a lot of the research that we've done and other labs have done while they're in adolescence, we don't see connections between parent perfectionism and adolescence or even younger. So, and one thing that came out from the interview studies that we've done is a lot of times the parents are like, they'll say like, we love them no matter what, like we accept them, we're shocked to hear this, like we don't know why this child has adopted this way of being. And a lot of times they'll say it's through sibling comparisons. So like, either my older sibling had a really difficult time, they put my parents through so much, I want to protect my parents, so I'm gonna be that much better. Or my child or my older sibling is the golden child, so I must live up to that, and the parents are largely unaware. So in all of those cases, what's interesting is the codependency. Oftentimes the parents aren't fully aware that the child won't go to their parents oftentimes for help, or won't go to kind of get validation from them overtly, because they see it as a flaw. So they're actually self-presenting to their parents quite commonly. So not codependence in the way you're thinking about it, I think.
Thank you.
Great, thank you both. I think we still have time for maybe one quick question, if anyone has one.
Can I ask Anne a question?
Yes, we can have it right across.
Because I never get to ask her this, so I'm gonna ask her now. And in the broader environment, like I know you're looking at neighborhood right now, and I know you're going to look at like schools, like what are some of the factors that you can highlight for us as parents that you think are key, like kind of like outside of the child that we can control? And how do you think, like if you could do social policy, what kind of things would you put in place?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I've been kind of thinking about this a lot these days, and also trying to understand what some of the mechanisms could be. Because the way I think about it is that these larger factors are shaping what's happening in our more immediate settings, right? So like what's happening at home or at school. And even if maybe children and youth don't know exactly what like the regional median income is, what's happening in that environment, they're going to perceive different things, and that's going to impact their behavior. So I was trying to think like overarchingly, what do these regional indicators really indicate? And I would imagine that it is a lot of the things that we've talked about, like the climate of like competition, or the climate of like inclusivity. And I think those are the things that if you're thinking of like a parent perspective, or even like educators' perspective, is like how we like our larger values of what we are saying, like what we're saying we tolerate versus what we are actually tolerating directly or indirectly. So I would think like when we're thinking of school policies, for example, and we're saying like, oh, we don't tolerate aggression or bullying, like what do the actual social relationships look like that reflect that or not? So that's kind of how I have been conceptualizing it, and trying to see if the data also match like what I'm thinking, or are what I'm thinking changing. And for some of those variables, like it did kind of, some of them were a bit surprising for me, like the post-secondary one, but thinking about the sample, which were undergraduate students who are probably coming from more affluent areas that have maybe more academic achievement, like relating to your research, I would imagine that there is a specific social culture that is impacting their experiences too. So yeah, so I would say, back to your question, I would say more about like what we say we value and how our practices reflect that. I hope that answers your question.
Great, thank you. So at this point, I'm just going to wrap things up. And on behalf of the Dean and the Dean's office, I really want to thank all of our presenters today. We've heard from faculty and student researchers from the fields of psychology, environmental sustainability, applied disability studies, and child and youth studies. Especially to our student presenters, Anton, Kristen, and Hannah. Thank you for sharing your research with us. We really hope that this has been a rewarding experience for you, certainly for all of us who are able to attend. It was great to see what each of you have gotten up to while you're pursuing your degrees here at Brock, and hear about the exciting and sometimes challenging areas that you're working in, because all research areas have those special challenges that make it just so exciting for us sometimes. And to our faculty presenters, Anne Farrell and Danielle Sirianni Molnar, of course, you've both chosen fairly challenging and very applied areas to research, and it's been our pleasure to acknowledge your achievements and learn more about your research today and what you're each heading into next. In addition to the contributions that you're both making to the field of child abuse studies, your work is also helping to distinguish the Faculty of Social Sciences at Brock University as a hub of important and influential scholarship that really makes a difference in the lives of children and youth and all those who support them. We'd also like to thank our guest speakers, Brian Roy, Associate Dean of the Faculty of Graduate Studies and Postdoctoral Affairs, and Michelle McGinn, she's Acting Vice President Research at Brock University. And finally, thank you to our online audience for helping us celebrate research excellence in Faculty of Social Sciences. I wish you all a very pleasant evening, and we're hoping to take this in person next year, so watch for that annual event coming up this time next year. Thank you, everyone. Have a lovely rest of your day.